Hey, adapters, welcome back. Today we have Tom Bowman as our guest. Tom is an author and communication advisor to businesses and institutions such as NOAA, NASA, the National Academy of Science, and the Aquarium of the Pacific. He was the writing team lead for the USA Strategic Planning Framework. Tom has received statewide recognition for decarbonizing his business. Tom appeals not to treat the climate crisis as a wicked problem, rather deal with it with a new, more constructive premise: stop burning fossil fuels. This premise gives us a metric to apply to the choices we make every day in our households, workplaces, and governance. Hey, Tom, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I love talking climate communication because I have a lot to say on the subject. So I'm curious what you're going to have to say. But, I thought maybe just to ground us a bit more, could you give us a little bit more background on, we talked about some of the things that you do, but elaborate
Mhm.
on that.
So I was in the exhibit design business for about 25 years, designing trade show exhibits, marketing campaigns, but also educational exhibits for aquariums, zoos, museums. And along the way, I was educated in climate science by members of the National Academy of Sciences. So these are some of the premier climate scientists in the country. And while doing that work and learning the science so that I could interpret it for the public, I realized that needed to be much greater efforts. And so I gradually transitioned out of my exhibit design business and have been working with scientists, social scientists, federal agencies, and others on strategies to basically engage the public in grappling with this challenge productively.
Okay, so let's just start off with a simple question. If so many people are concerned about climate change, why are so few people actively, I guess, seeking solutions on this issue?
Yeah, that's what I write about in my book, What If Solving the Climate Crisis is Simple? And the basic insight there is that we've really been learning about climate science primarily from scientists. And scientists are trained, thank goodness, to study global systems, which are incredibly complicated. The climate system, the way the climate interacts with oceans and land and the biosphere, the Arctic and Antarctic ice, and all of that. And this is complex stuff. And what's happened is that the discussions about what we can do about the climate systems has really focused equally on complex global systems such as food production and transportation, energy distribution and generation, international financial markets, the way the entire economy works, global trade, all of this stuff. And it creates a sense that this problem is too complicated to solve and it's far too big for any of us to participate in. And that essentially leaves everybody on the sidelines feeling dispirited. And the good news in all of that is that that's just an interpretation. That's just one way of looking at the problem. It's not a very productive way for most of us. And so what I've explored with this book is what happens if you turn that around and look at it as if your premise is this is a simple problem that all of us can engage with.
Okay, so we'll get into that, but I guess I'm more curious even about climate communications. Why is it so hard? And I understand the message, like the whole issue of climate change is simpler than we realize, but climate
Mhm.
communications might not be. What has been your
Yeah.
experiences with people that have been really good climate communicators?
They connect with people. There's a wonderful paper by a scholar named Baruch Fishoff, a decision scientist, who says, human beings overestimate how widely our values are shared, how widely our knowledge is shared, and how good we are at communicating. And so most campaigns try to tell us what to think, or they try to tell us how to feel about it. And the communications that are effective are communications that engage with people where they actually are, about the issues that are salient to them, about the value systems that they already hold. People don't want to change their value systems. And so effective communication really is about understanding the audiences that we're dealing with and learning how to listen really well.
Well, who are some of your favorite climate communicators? Who are some of the people out there right now?
Hmm. They cover such a wide range. On the one hand, there's a guy like Michael Mann, the climate scientist, who has been in the crucible of the denial campaign. He's been attacked, endlessly, and he's written and spoken heroically about what it's like to be an honest scientist who can't go into his office one day because police tape is covering the door because there's an envelope with white powder in it that might be anthrax, things like that. um, there are lots of scientists. I think of Richard Somerville and Richard Alley, who have made the effort to become climate communicators by learning how to present science in ways that are more accessible. There's an incredible project out of George Mason University led by a social scientist named Ed Maybeck called Climate Matters. They discovered that the only scientist most people know is the TV weathercaster. And so they've developed a program to help weathercasters talk about climate change in ways that connect with people rather than lead people to be confused by it. So there's that whole side of it. Um, and then there is this kind of fragmented approach to talking about our capacity to solve the climate crisis. And this is really where so much opportunity lies and has yet to be exploited. There are myriad individuals, entrepreneurs, NGOs, and others who talk about our collective capacity to change the world for the better. But they're not funded, they're not organized, they don't have access to audience research. They do the best they can. And in this context, I think that is probably one of our greatest opportunities to increase our skill. And I've met a lot of small business owners who have taken on the climate crisis as their own challenge, and they speak with real enthusiasm about reorganizing their businesses to tackle this challenge. The problem we have is that their audiences aren't big, right? And so the kind of work that you're doing here, that other podcasters and TV hosts are doing to try to bring solutions forward is really, really vital work.
I think it's a really interesting thing, and I've been obsessed with it over my career too, because I want to be a more effective communicator. It's like you get scientists, and Michael Mann. I've interviewed him several times now. Great guy,
Mhm.
he's a fantastic guy, just a bulldog too. He's just
He is.
fearless.
He is.
He's just
Yeah,
fearless.
he's a great guy.
And this notion of being confident in what you say. And so scientists, I always feel, start in a hole. And that's why I think Michael Mann's so effective. Catherine Hale is very effective, is that
She is.
not necessarily getting caught up with like, well, this is what this graph says. With 90% certainty. And when you start talking like that, you lose people. Instead, you
That's
need to
right.
say things like, I know this is happening. This is going to happen. And even though that makes a lot of scientists very, but that's why scientists in general, I think, are poor communicators on the subject because they're doing a good
Mhm.
job. But, I even look at someone like Donald Trump,
Right.
right? He might just be spouting off something completely misleading or wrong or a lie, but it just comes
Right.
off that he's so confident. And that's why so many of his people, well, he seems like he knows what he's talking about, and he's
Yeah.
absolutely confident in how he's saying it. And there's some lessons to be learned. That I hate to say that, but it's just like being
Well,
confident in how you say these things.
it's true. It's true. But let's temper our credit for Donald Trump
Right? Okay,
in
go
one
on.
particular way. It's more than confidence with him. He targets people's anxiety
Yeah.
in his speech, right? And we always say that with climate communication, we need to start appealing to people's emotions because facts alone don't motivate people. You have to speak to their emotions. The easiest emotions to prick are fear, anxiety, despair, anger, um, and in an economy that's become so unjust, where there's such an enormous discrepancy of income and where people feel the government doesn't listen to them, that opens the door to someone who speaks confidently like Trump does, but also targets those emotions. And the counter to that, really, in climate communication is to target hope. There's a lot of evidence that if you communicate in ways that make people fearful, they just turn away, they back up. There's no point rearranging the proverbial deck chairs on the proverbial Titanic. But if you encourage worry, and especially if you combine worry with hope, now people feel like they've got something they can deal with, and it creates much more sense of empowerment. And we really, as a community of communicators, haven't really risen to that occasion, or we haven't had the financial resources to do it broadly. Even Al Gore's transformational movie, back in 2006, 2007, An Inconvenient Truth, um, told a story, a bleak story, but then didn't really give people hope effectively. The things you could do at the end of the movie were out of scale with the scale of the challenge. Um, and let's admit that in 2007, the solutions landscape looked very different than it does today. Today, it's much more encouraging. So that's where I think the counter to learn confidence from Trump, learn the ability to touch people's emotions from Trump. But I think, yeah, I mean, and there may be room for anger in this. There are fossil fuel
Sure.
agents
Yeah.
and libertarians who have caused trouble intentionally, and anger at them is perfectly justified and reasonable. But let's also think about the other emotions that we want to communicate.
And I guess to qualify what you're talking about, playing to fear and such, that the content of what he's saying, I get that, and
Hmm.
that I guess I'm even talking style. You could flip off the volume and sort of look at it's like this guy seems confident in what he's saying, and I think
Yeah.
there's certainly lessons to be learned. But content wise, absolutely, the fear and doom and gloom hasn't worked very well for the climate side. So and I
No.
think that's the whole premise of a lot of things that you're talking about, and maybe we should just jump into that. This premise that how to solve the climate crisis is ultimately so simple. I could elaborate, and I guess that's your book talking all about this.
Yeah, so I'll tell you a little mental image that I got from a painting teacher when I was an art student in college. I was working on a painting and I just couldn't fix it. Everything I tried made it worse. And this professor came up behind me and he said, I said, I just can't make it work. What am I doing wrong? He said, hang that on the wall upside down and go home. Because when you come back tomorrow and you see it again, it's going to look completely different to you and you're going to see what's wrong with it. Right. And I sort of generalized that. Let's set the premise that the climate crisis is a horribly complex, Gordian wicked knot kind of problem aside, hang it upside down. What do we see? Well, we see that there's really one thing we have to do, and that's stop burning fossil fuels. We need to do it soon because of where we are, and we absolutely don't want to fail, right? So there's sort of a new mantra that replaces the wicked problem mantra, and the new mantra is stop burning fossil fuels well before mid-century and absolutely positively do not fail. Now when you take that on as an organization, as a household, as a government, everything becomes much more immediate, much more approachable because there are myriad decisions we all make that are amenable to thinking about doing them while burning less fossil fuels. And we can sort of stack our actions. We can do things today. We can think about long-term investments. What do we want to save for and do later? We can think about the ways we go about the decisions we make in our professional lives and our households and in our governance. It just brings it all close to home, and it gives us an imperative that's big enough to make us rethink things, but it's also accessible to us.
Okay, so this message of it being simple, and I like this. Simplicity is good. To me, the challenge has always been elevating the issue of climate change to give it the urgency it deserves. And like I always kind of equate it with like recycling. You're never going to
Mhm.
get everyone to sign on recycling just because they don't care that much about it. And
Right,
we've never made a convincing argument that the end of the planet is approaching because you're not recycling your cans, right? And we're not going to do that.
right.
How do we turn the climate change into like, let's say, an issue like where here's a meteor that's going to strike the earth, it's going to kill everybody. We would be able to sort of explain that relatively easy. And how do we kind of move climate change into that sort of category versus like it's not just recycling?
Yeah. So Pearl Harbor or a meteor crashing into the earth, these are cataclysmic events that are going to happen in a moment, essentially, right? They are singular events. Climate change doesn't present that to us. Climate change is this chronic, increasingly dire set of disasters and changing circumstances that screw us up. And so you can't put your finger on that event. What if we turn this around, though? What if we focus on the communities where people live, where 40% of Americans say they're actually experiencing the climate changing in their own lives in ways that matter? And what if we focus instead on things that we really want to do? What about eliminating air pollution? What about eliminating childhood asthma caused by air pollution? What about creating more equitable and interconnected cities? What about reducing the impacts and cost of wildfires and floods and hurricanes and things like that? In other words, why don't we shift the narrative to one of aspiration for the world we want to create rather than avoiding something that feels oppressive? It seems abstract, it seems distant, it's hard to relate to, you know, and focus instead on things that are really tangible, definitely of immediate concern, that affect our health and welfare and the future of our kids' lives. That's a whole different proposition now.
Okay, so I had mentioned the ACE project, but I didn't really kind of
Mhm.
explain it out. Could you explain what that is?
Sure. So there is a feature of the Paris Climate Agreement, one of the articles called Action for Climate Empowerment, or the acronym is ACE, which is handy. Action for Climate Empowerment calls on every country to create a strategy to engage the public as participants, as informed participants in finding solutions to the climate crisis. And there's an equity lens. They focus a lot on intergenerational responsibility, in other words, responsibility to the future generations, to people's kids, but also gender equity. And in the United States, race is just as important. Economic status is just as important. So, no, none of the major emitting countries has developed a national strategy for this yet. There's a lot of work going on this year as countries start to really engage this. But a group of people who work on climate action from a whole bunch of different perspectives, from education and communication and behavioral science and climate justice, environmental justice, community governance, civil service, got together last year around the opportunity of a possible new administration and said, what can we do to advance a national strategy so that a prospective Biden administration, if you will, could pick it up and run with it quickly. And and so what we created, this group of about a dozen or so very diverse people came together and developed a series of online dialogues that that I can tell you more about if you want to get into it. But the idea was that this group co-created a strategic vision, policy recommendations, and guiding principles and guiding strategies for creating a national strategy based on lots of professional experience, lots of lived experience in very different contexts, with a strong focus on equity and justice, on elevating the voices of people who would never get heard, and focusing at the community level where people actually make decisions and live this experience.
Okay, share your perspective. So we're what are we 2.5 months into the Biden administration? What is
Yeah.
your sense? Obviously, it's just a massive change to what we had in the previous 4 years. But how are they doing in regards to, let's say, ACE and all the other sort of things that are relevant to the work that you're doing?
I would say they are incredibly impressive, and there's a lot yet to be seen. So rejoining the Paris Agreement on day one was huge. Elevating John Kerry as climate envoy, who was one of the negotiators of Paris, was a big deal, and putting him on the National Security Council is a big deal too. Elevating Gina McCarthy and creating a White House office on domestic climate policy is a huge deal. And they understand the intersection of justice and effective climate action. They understand that this needs to be an all of government approach. That's what Biden's executive orders basically say. They also know that the public needs to be engaged. And so we're all waiting in the ACE community with bated breath to see if they pick up on what we've been creating and decide to really create a national strategy, engage with the rest of the world around action for climate empowerment. We think there's a good chance they will, because the next international climate meeting, which takes place next November, ACE is going to figure prominently in that. And so we know that they don't want to be embarrassed to go there and be lagging behind. They want to be seen as bold leaders. So I think there's incredible potential that we have never seen before politically in the United States.
And I'm curious your thoughts on this. And obviously, very impressed. All those names that you were just mentioning, it just demonstrates that Biden is serious about climate change. But as
It
you and I
does.
were talking about earlier, this whole notion about climate communication or developing a climate narrative, I didn't necessarily see that. I think there's so much that's just assumed. Oh, Gina McCarthy, she's obviously going to go out and talk about climate change, but elevating the whole notion of like creating climate change awareness. Is
Right.
that a new position or whatever? But I feel that's not there. It's just like, oh, it's this mundane stuff that we'll do kind of behind this. It's like, no, there needs to be a grand like
Yeah.
media push, and that's not there yet.
It's not there yet, and the contacts I have with federal agency people suggest that the agencies are all scrambling. I mean, all of the political appointees aren't even in place yet.
Mm.
And all of the agencies are looking at those executive orders. They're tasked to figure out how to move out quickly on this, and they're scrambling to figure out what to do. And scrambling sounds disorganized. I don't mean to say that. They're just moving very, very quickly. But you're right to say that effective communication, generally speaking, hasn't been the strong suit in wonky policy work. There needs to be an overarching message plan, and the Action for Climate Empowerment structure calls for the creation of that. Where that's going to come from and whether they will engage with that fully, it remains to be seen. And it's desperately needed. So I'm with you 100% on that, Doug. We don't know yet if they're going to rise to that part of the challenge.
Well, and they could go dust things off. You think of World War II and all of the,
Mm,
and propaganda has such a negative connotation around it, but propaganda and
right.
the use of something positive, and you like the victory gardens, and there was positions created specifically to communicate with the American public around World War II. Is climate change serious or isn't it? And I guess that's what I want to see, that real efforts dedicated
Yeah.
toward the communication side.
There are two comments I want to make about that. One is that they're framing this new infrastructure bill that, $3 trillion they're talking about. This is transformationally huge. And they're talking about 40% of that money going to disadvantaged communities. They don't, I'm not sure how that's going to work yet, but they're talking about that, which is really important. Green infrastructure, green jobs, all of this kind of investment that's constructive is all sort of opportunity. It's coming through an opportunity lens, which is good. This is a good framing. It's not let's avoid disaster. It's more about let's build back in a way that builds us back stronger for the future we're headed for. That part's really good. Gina McCarthy recorded a video on the White House website where she talks about their approach to climate change, and it talks about justice, it talks about technology, it talks about the economy, it talks about creating green jobs, talks about youth. And at the end, it says, she's sort of talking about youth, and she's saying, it's kind of like Franklin Roosevelt's message, I agree with you, now go make me do it. They're calling upon the public to vote, to demand change, and that the administration will give us the future that we deserve. It basically says those words. And I think that the missing link in there is that it's still top down, right? It's not saying let's co-create the future that we all want together. You are empowered. I mean, their actions will help with that, but their messaging needs to catch up with that, I
Well,
think.
and this is kind of embedded in some of the executive orders, but this is, I think, some of the right signs is that there's the proposal of like a climate core. And I don't know if
Yeah.
they're going to use AmeriCorps as sort of the vehicle. I don't know. I think there's just still discussing that. But to me,
Mhm.
all of a sudden you're creating ambassadors around the issue of climate change by
That's
hiring
right.
these people. So more stuff like that. We lose so many opportunities just to talk about climate change when
Absolutely.
we're building a bridge that's resilient to sea level rise, but you might not budget any money to sort of explain to the public why that was important to do that.
That is absolutely true. And there's lots of evidence from social science research that one of the reasons the public isn't moving on climate change, is that we just don't talk about it much. Something like a quarter of people talk about it at all. So 75% of or 67% of people just aren't talking about climate change at all. Either doesn't come up, or they don't feel comfortable about it, or they feel like they're going to get beaten up if they do it. If we can turn that around, if we can create millions of ambassadors, hundreds of thousands of ambassadors who talk positively about tackling climate change, it suddenly creates support. It makes it easy to talk about it. It makes people feel confident talking about what they're doing too. And it creates this sense of shared expectation that we're all going to do something useful about it.
I've had this conversation, especially with practitioners who are working in the field. Maybe they're working with farmers, and they say, "Well, when I go out, I don't talk about climate change, but I'll frame it as like, well, are storms getting worse in ways that they can understand and appreciate it? And quite honestly, I'm like, you're missing an opportunity. You don't need to go out there and insult them or be doom and gloom, but be matter of fact.
Yeah.
And you're just punting the ball on this issue by just not treating them like, I quite honestly, like adults. It's like, well, this
Yeah.
is the science. This is, but you can do it. And if they gives them a little bit of heartburn, you're not there to insult the people. Do it in a respectful way.
I was talking, there's a community in Kansas called Greensburg that's considered a model green city. That town, a little farm town, maybe 8 or 10,000 people, that was shrinking like so many farm towns do as young people grow up and move away. The whole town was wiped out by a force 5 tornado
That's
in
right.
one night, right? It was just gone. And the community had to decide whether to rebuild. With some state support and federal support, they decided to rebuild as a model green city, and now it's an international destination.
Yeah.
They get all their energy from wind. There's less pollution there. They have all these energy efficient homes and LEED certified business buildings, etc. And I was talking to one of the city fathers about it once, and I asked, as we talked, I said, you're talking about all these sort of left coast liberal values, right? About the environment. He said, "Oh, no, no, no. We may not use the language you use, but we're farmers. Taking care of the land is in our blood. It's what we do." And so, you discover we share the same values. We avoid the politically sensitive language, but um, people are people at one level, and so listening carefully and understanding how to encourage the values that are productive that they already have is a big part of learning how to communicate this issue.
Well, we are at the end of the interview, but I want to get one last chance. What's up next for you? And please, you've got a couple of books that you've written. I want you to hold those up just to
Yeah,
say,
so what if solving the climate crisis is simple? Part of a really interesting book series called Resetting Our Future. This is the one that talks about turning our perceptions of the problem upside down and feeling empowered, all of us, to be actors in this. The second is the report from this process on ACE. It's called Empowering Climate Action in the United States, co-edited with Deb Morrison at the University of Washington. And this includes the summary report of that process last summer, along with additional commentaries by a real interesting variety of climate leaders.
excellent. Well, this is a fascinating conversation. As you can tell, I could talk about this for the next 2 hours.
All day. We could sure do that.
And disagree with you on some things and agree with you. And I love this topic. But I'm gonna take you into just chatting. So just hold on a sec. But thanks for coming on and congratulations on the books and good luck with what you're doing.
Thanks so much. It's been my pleasure.
All right, hold on. We'll be right back.